Hello everyone. So unfortunately we're going to be a little bit low tech for this week, but we will be back to normal hopefully by Saturday-ish. No promises, but that's the ambition. Funnily enough, I actually can have the regular webcam on this. However, there's only 2 USB ports here, and I don't have a splitter at the moment, so let's get that a bit higher up, like that. Just bear with me one moment. I have double the equipment on my desk right now, so maneuvering's a little bit tricky. But we'll be on our way shortly. Bring that down. And I'm just pulling up chat on my phone so I can see you guys easily. As of course is tradition. Potato vision, exactly. Hey, but at least this camera angle doesn't make it look like I have no chin, so that's kind of nice. What do we have here? Alright, well, good. Okay. Anyways, if I'm at a low angle and I'm looking a little bit grayer than usual, that's why. So. I'm not entirely certain how I want to proceed here. Wow, my audio is way up. Let's turn that down a little bit. There we go. That seems a bit more reasonable. New frame is a bit of rusted metal. I had to throw it together fast, okay? But that's the frame for now. This is the Punished Sunday frame. So I'm not 100% sure how I want to proceed here. This is a bit of a first for me, which is of course the reason why I'm doing it. However, I had this thought earlier. There was a back and forth between, I can't for the life of me remember how to pronounce it, Kurzgesagt, that weird, is that German? You know that weird science education channel with like the weird little bird people? That and Bad Empanada on whether or not anything can be done politically about climate change. So, given that this is primarily a politics channel, that is a question of particular interest to my discipline. So that's a point of intervention that we can make fairly fluidly. So I'm almost kind of thinking to begin with, just to sort of get our bearings, if watching those two in conjunction with each other, and not criticizing them per se, but just taking note of what the points of contention are, that would be an interesting way to start. And then I thought we could just move straight on to looking at the IPCC reports. Which I've never taken time to look at, so this is going to be legitimately a very educational couple of weeks. We're not going to just do this going forward. The reason why we were really hyper-focused on deplatforming last time is because I had a debate coming up, and it was sort of a test of principle, I suppose. So what we're going to start doing is we're going to start doing like a couple of days on one topic, a couple of days on another topic. We're going to kind of alternate. Among other things, I wanted to start looking at issues around economic inequality, which I am not entirely uncynical in ordering that way because one of my patrons, I feel like a televangelist referring to them as gifts, but one of my patrons gifted me a book off of my Amazon list that happens to be on economic inequality by Amartya Sen. Who is, I don't know if he's Indian by nationality, but he's Indian-born professor of economics at Harvard. Is he alive still? I don't know if Amartya Sen's still alive. He wrote, if anyone's read a very good book, which I will also be reviewing as well at some point, Albert Hirschman's The Passions and the Interests. published by Princeton. He wrote the introduction to this, so that's my primary exposure to Amartya Sen. And of course, there are he's talked about a lot. He's a fairly famous political economist, and political theorist and philosopher. There are episodes of the Partially Examined Life that talk about his books. He's big. Kurtz or bad empanada? We're gonna look at both. Okay, so let me pull those up quickly. And Leo, I did respond to your message. You are welcome on any time, of course. However, there's not going to be much to talk about just this moment because I'm just going to be going over those two videos. So my suggestion would be, however long that takes, wait till that's done, and then maybe we can chat afterwards. I might stop to grab some water quickly before we begin. What do we got going on here? Okay, looks like everything's good here. Alright, so let me just pull this up quickly. Kurzgesagt. Not Kurzgestat, Kurzgesagt. I can tell I'm reading too many Germans. Oh my god, it's an hour long. No, Kurzgesagt, we won't fix climate change. Yes, that's the one. Alright, hopefully this won't start playing automatically. So you don't just hear Curious George's voice blasting through the thing. There we go. I caught it. Okay. Oh god, he responded. Oh, that's interesting. That might actually take a long time. Anyways, let's see. Does he have a link to the original video? Yes, he does. Good. Brilliant. Oh, this is only 16 minutes. Good. So we can sort of jump around with the Bad Empanada one. We won't miss much. That's good. Oh my god. Okay. President Sunday, read the wiki article in Evolutionary Economics. Evolutionary science is a better framework than Marxism for understanding social change. That is very random and has nothing to do with what we're talking about today, unfortunately. It's also, if by evolutionary science I mean organic evolution, it's also very, very wrong. Okay, so let me pull this up. Oh, good, it actually worked. Oh, Frabjeste, Kalukale. Okay, let's make that smaller. God, I cut this so weird. Okay, hang on, let me fix this. Oh, I see what's going on. I've got it in, not default view. There we go, that's better. That's still cut weird, isn't it? It'll do, though. Let's just go with this. There we go. That'll do. And we probably want a bit of the, want the video title on this screen too. I am not a thief. Can we get rid of this context thing? Oh, I guess we can't see because the bloody context thing's blocking it all. Oh well, Kurzgestat's bigger than this anyways. Alright, let us begin.
Our home is burning. Rapid climate change is destabilizing our world. It seems our emissions will not fall quickly enough to avoid runaway warming, and we may soon hit tipping points that will lead to the collapse of ecosystems and our civilization. While scientists, activists, and much of the younger generation urge action, it appears...
Sunday, I spread the link. Some of the climate scientists are eager to talk. Is the server open? To them, absolutely. Just send them a link.
Most politicians are not committed to doing anything meaningful, while the fossil fuel industry still works actively against change.
Hey, that's me.
It seems humanity can't overcome its greed
tell by the
and
hat.
obsession with short-term profit and personal gain to save itself.
Look at all those yellow blood cells.
And so for many, the future looks grim and hopeless. Young people feel particularly anxious and depressed. Instead of looking ahead to a lifetime of opportunity, they wonder if they will even have a future, or if they should bring kids into this world. It's an age of doom and...
Kurzats isn't one person, they're a private company. I mean, you can tell, like, the production values are beyond, I couldn't do this. This would take so much time.
Hopelessness, and giving up seems the only sensible thing to do. But that's not true. You are not doomed. Humanity is not doomed. Despite the seriousness of the situation, for years positive trends have accumulated, and there is finally some good news and a clear path towards our collective climate goals. Welcome to our TED Talk. Please watch this video to the end. Check out our detailed sources afterwards to learn more. Okay, let's start with the scariest things. Cancelling the apocalypse. Some of the most widely shared stories about climate change are that it is an existential threat, the end of human civilization, and maybe even our own extinction event, and that it's basically unavoidable now. But what does science actually say? As of 2022, the global average temperature has risen 1.2 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial times. Limiting warming to 1.5 degrees was the most ambitious goal of the Paris Agreement, but we are not likely to meet it. Already with the warming we have today, hot places will get hotter, wet places wetter, and the risk and strength of extreme weather events increase significantly. Warming beyond 2 degrees makes all of these extremes more extreme. Extreme weather events more common, with more ecosystems under major pressure. Some will not survive. At 3 degrees, significant parts of Earth, especially in developing countries, might become unable to feed their populations. Heat waves will become a major global issue. Large-scale natural systems will break down. The scale and frequency of hurricanes, fires, and droughts will further increase and cause trillions in damage. Poor regions and subsistence farmers will be hit the hardest. Hundreds of millions of people will need to leave their homes. In the 4 to 8 degree range, the apocalypse begins. The hothouse Earth, where things change so quickly that it may become unable to support our large human population, and billions may perish, leaving the rest on a hostile alien planet. A decade ago, for lack of action and perspective, many scientists assumed a 4+ degree world was our future, and a lot of public communication focused on exactly this future path. Luckily, it's much less likely that this version of the apocalypse will come to pass. If current climate policies stagnate, we're likely to end up with warming of around 3 degrees Celsius by 2100, which is scary and tragic and far from acceptable. But this is actually good news. How? In the last decade, we've seen enough progress that most scientists now think that we have likely avoided apocalyptic climate change. Although substantial risk still remains, we can pretty confidently say that humanity isn't going anywhere. Civilization might have to change, but it will endure. Which begs the question, what has changed over the last 10 years, and is this really good news? The invisible shift. You probably know this story. The last decade has been an immense failure for climate policies around the world. Instead of passing comprehensive, binding bills that would meaningfully reduce emissions, we mostly did nothing. A lost decade with one negative record after another. And this story is true, and it's one reason why so many people are giving up. But it is not the whole picture. Despite the lack of climate policies and ongoing lobbying and misinformation campaigns from the fossil fuel industries, there was a lot of progress. Let's go back 20 years to see why today is so different. Between 2000 and 2010, greenhouse gas emissions had grown by 24%, 3 times as much as the increase in the previous decade. Subsidies for fossil fuels aimed at promoting economic growth caused a colossal increase in their consumption. For developing countries like China and India, coal was the cheapest fuel for growth, while rich countries showed little interest in changing their ways. In 2010, many people expected these trends to continue. Instead of decreasing fossil fuel use, its consumption would rise. The next decade turned out to be very different though. First of all, coal burning in developing countries like India has slowed down or leveled off like in China, and it's plummeted in rich countries like the UK and US. Since 2015, 3/4 of planned coal plants have been cancelled and 44 countries have committed to stop building them. 10 years ago, that would have seemed like wishful thinking, but today we can say with confidence, coal is dying. It's just not competitive anymore, because technologies we thought would remain expensive matured rapidly instead. Renewable electricity has shown explosive progress. In a mere decade, wind energy got 3 times cheaper. Solar electricity is now 10 times cheaper. Cheaper than coal or any other fossil fuel burning power plant, despite the massive subsidies and global infrastructure propping up fossil fuels. 25 times more solar and nearly 5 times more wind electricity is produced today compared with 10 years ago, which is of course not nearly enough.
Yeah, I was going to say 5 times what?
One of the biggest obstacles is the variability of their power output. Renewables need a lot of energy storage to be a reliable power source, like expensive batteries. Amazingly, battery prices have decreased by 97% in the past 30 years, 60% in the last decade alone, which will serve all kinds of green technology like electric cars. You might say, well, that's great, but didn't Kurzgesagt's last climate video say that while wind and solar are nice, we need nothing less than a fundamental transition of our global industrial system? Yes, but luckily the shift goes beyond just the energy sector. Throughout the economy, people are working on improving current technology to lower emissions. We're rapidly replacing old incandescent light bulbs with LEDs that are 10 times more efficient. In 2020, about 7 out of 10 new cars in Norway were electric or hybrid. In 2021, it was already 8 out of 10. And the list goes on, from electric heating and better insulation to ships traveling at half speed to save fuel. Wherever you look, you find scientists, engineers, and entrepreneurs trying to solve some aspect of climate change. Enormous amounts of human ingenuity are being brought to bear on this problem, with more and more people deciding to prioritize preventing rapid climate change. Solutions for low-carbon production of cement, electronics, and steel, and innovations like artificial...
Yeah, I'm not buying a lot of this. Like, I haven't looked into any of this data, so I'm just going to take it on good faith. It doesn't seem to me that the bare fact that coal use has plateaued, if indeed it truly has, means that therefore so have the effects. I don't think that's how that works. This video says a lot regarding emissions, but says nothing of the loss of biodiversity. The thing is, though, renewables still ain't good enough to be efficient, and the materials used to make these renewables still destroys the environment. Yeah.
meat and carbon capture are in the works. The more of these technologies we deploy, the cheaper new and better technology gets. The cheaper they get, the more people use them, and so on. We can see the impact already. The domestic CO2 output of rich countries is falling without a major recession. Since the year 2000, the EU as a whole shows a 21% decrease, Italy 28%, the UK 35%, Denmark 43%. But the best news may be that emissions are no longer necessarily coupled with the economic growth.
Hang on, I missed that first bit there.
The technology gets. The cheaper they get, the more people use them, and so on. We can see the impact already. The domestic CO2 output of rich countries is falling without a major recession. Since the year 2000, the EU as a whole shows a 21% decrease, Italy 28%, the UK 35%, Denmark 43%. But the best news may be that emissions are no longer necessarily coupled with the economic growth. In the past, this was an inconvenient truth. To get richer, you had to emit more, which led to fierce arguments between developing and developed countries about the fairness of reducing emissions while their populations were still poor. But in the last decade, we've seen that it is possible to increase prosperity without increasing emissions. Emissions in the Czech Republic dropped 13%, while their GDP grew by 27%. France reduced their CO2 emissions by 14%, while increasing GDP by 15%. Romania saw an 8% decrease and 35% growth.
This seems like I don't know what the relationship is, but this seems like a basic correlation equals causation error here. Like you're showing me two different stats, but you're not demonstrating the connection.
And even the largest economy on Earth, the USA, decreased emissions.
The CO2 output of rich countries has only increased, not decreased, if you take into account the way they've pushed their industries off to other countries. Exactly. Like that would be something that would put a bit of a damper on this optimistic account here.
Emissions by 4% while growing their GDP by 26%. Some of you may call this a numbers trick, that rich countries are just exporting emissions to poorer nations by moving the dirty parts of their economies like manufacturing. But even when we account for all of our imported goods, the numbers still look positive. It's no longer a matter of having to choose between prosperity and the climate.
Are they going to show those numbers?
A decade ago. Developing countries will profit from that because as rich countries pay for the expensive development of green technologies, they can adopt them more cheaply. They can skip most of the high emission phase that today's rich countries went through. We are at the point where not...
That doesn't follow. Like, maybe that's true, but he hasn't presented an argument for why that would follow. And I don't think that's true.
Decarbonizing is a bad business decision. And we haven't even really talked about solutions like carbon capture. In 2000, it didn't really exist. In 2022, that technology does exist and costs around $600 to remove 1 ton of CO2 from the atmosphere. As investment pours in and the technology matures and begins to scale, it's likely that these costs will plummet over the next few decades. So everything's fine then? Well, let's not get carried away. All of these processes are great.
Yeah, there's a weird combination of just this assumption that the technology just has limitless potential for increased efficiency, combined with lower cost, and that there just aren't any material impediments to actually implementing these. But that seems untrue on its face. What are this? Really? Sources and further reading. Here. Let me open this on my private thing. Let's see where this takes us. Okay. All right, well, let's see where these sources go. Okay, so Dr. Hannah Ritchie, World in Data. Okay, so what you want first of all when you have like a list of sources like this is you just want the sources. You don't want like extensive annotations. If you're going to give extensive annotations, you want to provide some kind of legend for what kinds of sources there are. Excuse me. Pollen's really bad. If I seem like I'm about to fall asleep, it's because I am. Pollen's been brutal. Alright, we'll keep going. I'm not going to be able to go over that today.
But not nearly fast enough. We're still doing way too little, and technology will not magically solve everything. We need to use fewer resources and use them longer, design consumer goods that are repairable and durable, and decrease our energy requirements. We need much better infrastructure, agriculture, and cities. It will still be hard work, especially to get the right policies passed and enacted. But for the first time ever, there are a few trend lines pointing solidly in the right direction. And now imagine if all of this was achieved without proper financial and political support, and despite fossil fuel lobbying. Just think what humanity can do when climate change finally gets the political attention and funding it needs. So is it okay to feel hopeful again? The situation is still dire and serious, so what's the point of focusing on...
Isn't there a term for perpetually counting on innovation, techno-optimism, if I remember correctly? I don't know, but that'd be a useful term to have.
On this side of the story? The trap of hopelessness. Climate change can feel overwhelming and make your future seem bleak. The sadness and hopelessness that many people...
Yeah, right now, we're not in a position to actually, at least I'm not in a position to judge these sources and to go through it efficiently. So I think what we're going to do is, as kind of maybe a capstone to the first couple of segments on climate change, we'll go back and see with what we've established, what we actually make of their resource page. I think that'd be a useful exercise.
People feel is real and very destructive because it causes apathy. Apathy that is only serving the fossil fuel industry, that is still delaying change however it can. In a sense, they have weaponized hopelessness. We are now in Phase 4 in the public debate about rapid climate change action. Phase 1 was, climate change is not real. Phase 2 was, climate change is real, but not caused by humans. Phase 3 was, climate change may be caused by humans, but it's not that bad. Phase 4 is, climate change is no longer avoidable. We are doomed, and it doesn't matter what we do. If we want the world to change, we first need to believe that change is possible, and we have an abundance of evidence that it is. Changes to our industrial system are gaining momentum. Technology gets better and cheaper. Climate change has become a key issue in most free elections. As more and more younger people move into influential positions, they prioritize climate change and work on new solutions. In 2022, most governments not only acknowledge it, but set their own net zero goals in democratic and autocratic countries. The results of years of fighting a steep uphill battle are now clearly visible. The pressure needs to keep increasing to make sure that the promises made today are actually kept. Climate doomerism is the equivalent of giving up, even though you can still prevent not just the worst case, but also mitigate most of the bad things, make changes in time to adapt better, and prevent the poorest from suffering.
Unless you can't. Which is the immediate retort. Doomerism, quote unquote, is a bad thing if it's wrong or presumptuous, but is that the case? We have not established this yet. Bluntly. Like, we just haven't.
That is why hopelessness and apathy are so dangerous. If the last, in many ways, wasted decade has shown anything, then it's that progress is being made, and that dire scenarios are just predictions, not our sealed fate. As of 2022, based on current global policies, we will end up in a 3 degrees world. Now it's our job to yet again prove the predictions wrong, despite how serious and urgent things are. To turn that 3 degrees into a 2 degrees and then see where we can go from there. For that, we need hope. And we hope we gave you that today, at least a little. That you feel that things are serious, but also that you have a future. That you can have kids without dooming them or the world. That taking action today is worth it. And that despite powerful industries doing everything to delay it, society is changing. If you need a more concrete roadmap of what you can do personally, we're working on a follow-up video to talk about that in greater detail. Doomerism, inactivity, and weaponized hopelessness are the only trump cards left for the powers that don't want change. Don't let them win. We're still excited about the future, and we think one of the best things you can do to keep your optimism and curiosity up is to learn new things.
No, we are not learning any new things. Learning is bad for the soul. Okay.
The YouTube channel Kurgazat
Let's check the audio here.
recently released a video about climate change, and its overall argument is best summarized by the title and thumbnail. Good news! We will fix climate change. Bad news though, this video is wrong and frankly just dishonest in many ways. A few of the facts that it presents are incorrect, the others are all very misleading, and most importantly, combined, they don't even come close to backing up the lofty claim made in the title and thumbnail. They heavily downplay the already inevitable effects of climate change, while presenting minor, inconsequential developments as if they're going to have any meaningful effect at all.
I hate that I have to agree with this guy, but judging from what I've seen, this seems fairly accurate. Pending somebody effectively objecting to the contrary, which I guess that's always an objection is. Let's move on.
They won't. Rather than feeling optimistic and hopeful about what is in truth an awful situation, as their video preaches while downplaying its true severity, you should be angry. Very, very angry. So now I'm going to refute it and explain all of this while also delving into the ideology behind the narrative. Let's get into it. Here's their intro, which is a good summary of what they're going for.
Our home is burning. Rapid climate change is destabilizing our world. It seems our emissions will not fall quickly enough to avoid runaway warming, and we may soon hit tipping points that will lead to the collapse of ecosystems and our civilization. While scientists, activists, and much of the younger generation urge action, it appears most politicians are not committed to doing anything meaningful, while the fossil fuel industry still works actively against change. It seems humanity can't overcome its greed and obsession with short-term profit and personal gain to save itself. And so for many, the future looks grim and hopeless. Young people feel particularly anxious and depressed. Instead of looking ahead to a lifetime of opportunity, they wonder if they will even have a future, or if they should bring kids into this world. It's an age of doom and hopelessness, and giving up seems the only sensible thing to do. But that's not true. You are not doomed. Humanity is not doomed.
The first 35 seconds or so there are an entirely accurate assessment of the present situation, and we're going to be going over just how throughout this video. The follow-up, however, is very much not. It's a complete straw man of what acknowledging the reality of the future that we're facing results in, and it's presented as if it's the only possible outcome. And it's this straw man that the entire video relies on. From here, despite having just candidly acknowledged the real direness of the situation for the only time in this entire video, they turn to vastly downplaying it and overcorrecting to counter what they call doomerism. They're not trying to convince the viewer that their knowledge of and their righteous anger at the dire reality could be harnessed to spur political change, but rather they're trying to convince them that the reality is just not actually that bad. They mislead in order to encourage a sort of toxic positivity. The suppression of legitimate and rational negative emotions that are actually an appropriate response to the situation.
Toxic positivity. Okay. Where I come from, we just call that misplaced optimism, but whatever.
And that could actually spur people into undertaking the needed collective action. The straw man they present here as some sort of huge issue to justify them making this argument barely even exists. People who acknowledge the full extent and the grim reality of climate change are actually the biggest advocates for fighting it, and for holding those guilty of impeding our response to it to account. Not for just giving up and doing nothing. If such a group even really exists in sufficient numbers to merit being called a group, then they're still such a tiny minority that you really have to wonder just why it is that this channel decided to single them out and use them as a justification to basically downplay climate change. Throughout the video, they do make a few more token acknowledgements that yes, climate change is bad, and yes, we aren't doing enough to stop it. But that notion is contradictory to the actual content of their argument, in which they heavily downplay just how bad climate change is going to be, vastly overstate the importance of inconsequential developments that mean absolutely nothing, and a couple of times even just outright lie. So before you head down to the comment section and write something like, "But they said climate change is bad in the video." Yeah, I know that. I've watched the video numerous times, trust me.
Or are my Discord notifications going off? One moment. I don't think I haven't muted it on this computer. For some reason it's... I wonder if it's because I don't have the app open? I thought I muted them all though, that's why you weren't hearing them. Okay, let's see here. Disable all notification sounds. Boom! There we go. Now we shouldn't be hearing that anymore.
You kind of have to make a video like this. But in between those occasional disclaimers, they're still massively downplaying it, so that they did still acknowledge that it's bad can't be used as some sort of automatic exoneration here. They also completely fail to argue for the potentially damaging thesis of their video, and I'm about to go into just how.
Cancelling the apocalypse. Some of the most widely shared stories about climate change are that it is an existential threat, the end of human civilization, and maybe even our own extinction event, and that it's basically unavoidable now. But what does science actually say? As of 2022, the global average temperature has risen 1.2 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial times. Limiting warming to 1.5 degrees was the most ambitious goal of the Paris Agreement, but we are not likely to meet it.
Here we have a very misleading statement. The 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels global temperature target of the Paris Agreement was not simply ambitious. This could just be some unfortunately ambiguous wording rather than something intentional, like maybe they meant it as ambitious relative to other potential targets or something, but the effect on many viewers is nonetheless going to be the same. It gives off the impression that us missing that target is not that bad, because it was really ambitious anyway, you know?
Right.
Not something that we needed to do, just was kind of like a nice goal to have. But the truth is that the reason that the 1.5 degree threshold has been emphasized so much is because going above that limit would just be absolutely awful for the world and for humanity. That there's absolutely no chance whatsoever that we're going to meet it is not simply like the result of us having aimed too high and having been too ambitious. It's a massive unmitigated disaster. Hundreds of millions more people are going to die because of this. To call that just ambitious without being more precise is kind of like saying that it would just be ambitious to try and stop a massive asteroid from hitting the Earth. The absolute bare minimum acceptable goal is a much more honest way to put it, and I'm about to get into why.
Already with the warming we have today, hot places will get hotter, wet places wetter, and the risk and strength of extreme weather events increase significantly. Warming beyond 2 degrees makes all of these extremes more extreme, extreme weather events more common, with more ecosystems under major pressure. Some will not survive.
They're vastly downplaying the effect that 2 degrees of warming is going to have on the world and its people. They say simply that the extremes will become a bit more extreme and that there will be ecosystems under pressure. And some of these ecosystems will not survive. That's just such a weird thing to mention without going at all into the consequences of what that will actually mean for, like, human beings.
Here's something interesting that happened this year. So we had an unusually hot summer, right? Unusually hot. Like 500 plus people died from the heat wave in BC. And then it got cooler and rainy, and you're like, oh great, that's great. It's okay now. It's cooled down. It rained heavily. Not the heaviest it's ever rained here before, but it rained fairly heavily for a few days. And one of the things that nobody accounted for was the hot summer caused the ground to dry and condense and turn into, maybe not condense, but become unabsorbent. And so when the rain started coming down, all of that water, instead of being absorbed into the ground, put roads and entire towns under like 15 feet of water. It was insane. I'm at the base of a mountain. There's a small stream that I walk to. I have to go downhill to get to it, that I sometimes read at. It's easily about 30 feet below where I'm standing right now. I think if you combine everything, maybe about 20 feet. The river itself is like 30 feet. The water was so high, it was almost level with the highway above it. We lost shipping to the island because our main roadway was not flooded, gone. It was insane.
Instead, they just show like an image of a dead elephant. That's it. No numbers, nothing about more specific consequences, just a dead elephant. It's all being presented very, very impersonally and detached. It's like this...
Present Sunday, the peer review is Greg, a scientist working on climate change solutions. Oh, hi, Greg, or peer review, however you prefer to be called. Pleasure to have you here. Thank you very much for joining us.
Was written by an android or something. It's like just saying that dropping a nuclear bomb on a city would cause a large explosion and some buildings would not survive. You know, without actually acknowledging what that would mean for the millions of people in that city and the millions of people in those buildings and the millions of people who rely on that city for their survival. Death and misery on a massive, massive scale. I'm going to elaborate more in just a minute on what the absolutely disastrous effects of 2 degrees of warming will be, and which they completely gloss over. But first, here's their video's presentation of the effects of even higher levels of warming.
At 3 degrees, significant parts of Earth, especially in developing countries, might become unable to feed their populations. Heat waves will become a major global issue. Large-scale natural systems will break down. The scale and frequency of hurricanes, fires, and droughts will further increase and cause trillions in damage. Poor regions and subsistence farmers will be hit the hardest. Hundreds of millions of people will need to leave their homes. In the 4 to 8 degree range, the apocalypse begins. The hothouse Earth, where things change so quickly that it may become unable to support our large human population and billions may perish, leaving the rest on a hostile alien planet.
So they continue with their very impersonal framing there, sticking more to vague, wishy-washy references to the effects on broad systems, with little mention of what that actually means for human beings. They mention trillions in damage in the 3 degrees part. It's so weird that that is what they chose to quantify here. Apparently, the monetary cost is more relevant than the effect on human lives, than the death and suffering which is encompassed by this number. It's so cold and disconnected to point to that, rather than to the billions of people who are going to suffer or die. You know what's more important than actual people?
Yes, Titan, you can send and any scientists or whatever who want to talk with me, or researchers or people who are in the know about stuff that we're researching. They get wave them through if we're ever locked down, because we're dealing with people like this, for example. Unfortunately. Why do you have to be crazy bad, Empanada? Your material's good.
The abstract notion of the economy. Could you imagine someone just being like, the Holocaust cost $100 billion, without mentioning the millions of deaths? Same thing here, it's just bizarre framing. And the effects that they attribute to 3 degrees of warming are not just being left ambiguous, but would actually happen at the 1.5 or 2 degree thresholds that we have practically no chance of avoiding at this point. They're massively downplaying what 2 degrees of warming actually means for us. Unlike them, I'm going to put these effects into actual human terms, because doing so really puts the complete disaster that we're facing into the most rightfully shocking perspective. Once we pass the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold and begin approaching 2 degrees, at current rates, this might happen within just the next 5 years, and certainly before the end of the next decade.
Somebody find this document for me, climate change 50-50 chance of... I guess he's got most of the links in the description. Let's see. Okay. I have a channel in the Discord for anybody who's already there. Under stream notes, there's a thread where we're collating all of the resources that we can find on climate change and political response to climate change and all that stuff. If anybody wants to go through here and just relocate those to that channel, that would be extraordinarily helpful.
Complete and utter disaster is going to unfold in many regions of the world that billions of people call home. Natural disasters, as the video did acknowledge, will become much more intense and much more frequent, even more so than they already have as a result of climate change. If you thought like the recent Australian fires were bad, man, you really just haven't seen anything yet. This will especially negatively affect the global south, which is far less able to respond to disasters. Probably most significant among these disasters will be heat waves. At 1.5 degrees over pre-industrial levels, 13.8% of the world's population will be exposed to at least one deadly heat wave every 5 years. At 2 degrees, this rises astronomically to 36.9%, an additional 1.7 billion people, and more than a third of the global population in total. These heat waves will also be much more intense and much more frequent, and will particularly affect impoverished regions of the world, such as West and East Africa. At 2 degrees, sea levels will rise by 50 centimeters, with coastal sea levels rising even more. At least 130 million people are currently living in places that will be completely submerged by these sea level rises, and hundreds of millions more in places where life will be made completely untenable by the far increased frequency and intensity of flooding. Tens of millions will doubtlessly die as a result of this factor alone. Even
Thank you, peer review. That would be extraordinarily... I'm grateful for that. Thank you. Please do.
Worse than those consequences, though, is the complete disarray that anything above 1.5 degrees of warming is going to cause to global food supplies. We're already seeing how delicate this can be with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Agricultural exports being disrupted from one single, relatively small country have been enough to cause projections of a colossal crisis of malnutrition and starvation in big parts of the global south. Now imagine what's going to happen when climate change significantly reduces global agricultural yields, especially in the poorer parts of the world, raising food prices worldwide and destroying global food supply chains. Well, that's going to happen, and it's going to make every famine in history up until this point look like nothing in comparison. It's very difficult to quantify just how many people will die directly as a result. Estimates range from 100 million to 400 million more people at risk of hunger, though in reality the effects will likely be even more far-reaching, beyond what a simple mathematical projection can predict. Shortages of water of varying severity will affect a colossal 1 billion to 4 billion people, doubtlessly resulting in the deaths of hundreds of millions in the poorest parts of the world, where water access is already precarious. I can't list every single direct effect of climate change ever here, and there is much more than what I just went over, but that's a fair enough taste of what's to come, a shocking enough taste. And this is all so much worse when you consider the broader implications of all of this happening at the same time. It all compounding together. What's going to happen when many of the world's poorest regions, populated by billions upon billions of people, are hit by so many unprecedented catastrophes in very quick succession? Sure, hundreds of millions are going to die as a direct result of these factors, but it's not going to end there. Not remotely. There will be no recovery. This cascade of disasters will cause the destruction of supply chains, of social bonds, of systems that billions rely on to survive. Entire societies will collapse. States will collapse, dozens of them. All global civilization won't collapse. Most of these effects won't be nearly as severe in the developed world, which ironically is by far the most responsible for climate change, but in many places it absolutely will. That'll be
But is also, by the way, reliant on the developed world for a lot of the conveniences that make it the developed world, right? So it's... And the poor here will absolutely feel the effects too.
Perpetual state of chaos, most akin to war zones, one that cannot be recovered from because by that point the causes cannot be fought. Those who remain won't be able to do much more than desperately struggle to survive or flee to somewhere safer. Those who die or suffer purely due to more direct climate change related causes are really going to be in the minority, and hundreds of millions is quite a big minority, isn't it? The victims of the domino effects will be far more numerous. This will cause massive waves of refugees that will just so far eclipse anything before in history. The UN already estimates that more than 20 million people are displaced by climate change related causes per year, and we really haven't seen anything yet.
This is one of the reasons, by the way, why we're front-loading climate change and not investigation into fascism, because these are going to be intrinsically linked as we go further in.
Recent estimates indicate that as many as 1.2 billion people could be displaced by climate change related causes just by 2050, with intensity increasing as time goes by and the world gets hotter. If that's just within the next 25 years, then imagine how much worse it's going to be in the decades after that, in the 2060s, the 2070s, the 2080s, when the world is even hotter. Refugees during the 2015 European migrant crisis numbered about 1.3 million, an astronomical number to be sure, but what even do we call the number that is like, how many times? Like 1,000, 2,000 times higher than that? Is there a suitable adjective? It's literally nothing compared to what's in store in the future. The response to the 2015 crisis was highly militarized, with countries building fences and walls at their borders and sending troops and gunboats to try and prevent those desperate people from getting in. Similar trends are also seen in other rich countries, such as the USA and Australia, which have militarized border protection regimes designed to prevent and deter unauthorized migration through the threat and use of violence. The response of the rich countries...
And you see here how the function of borders fundamentally is actually has very little to do with politics in the traditional sense, because it doesn't actually set a barrier between one state and another one. What it actually does is it operates as, like, and so far as we're talking about like walled borders and borders that are guarded and that you require like paperwork and permissions to pass through, these are actually demographic filters primarily. They have very little to do with actual political relationships, because the people who are passing through without the correct paperwork aren't invading armies. They are people who have been let down by their state or are rejecting the protections offered by their state, if indeed they are offered any, or if indeed those protections are followed through on. These are no longer state actors. These are, there's a reason why we call these stateless individuals, right? Not just refugees, like anybody without paperwork is functionally the same. Ukraine refugee crisis is already higher than the number in 2015.
To this crisis of biblical proportions is certain to be a military one, and an infinitely more severe military one at that. Not just due to this infinitely larger flow of refugees, but also due to the far increased scarcity of global resources caused by climate change. If you thought politicians who weaponize anti-immigration sentiment were bad now, I wish you luck in the future. When you open whatever the dominant social media platform might be many years from now, and you see graphic footage of French warships blowing up fishing trawlers full of migrants with their main guns, American soldiers shooting machine guns into crowds of them at their southern border like a zombie movie, the Japanese self-defense force defending itself from desperate Filipinos, and concentration camps in the Australian desert full of Indonesians starving to death, whose homes were enveloped by the sea and whose government subsequently collapsed. That's very optimistic, actually. Realistically, they're just going to shoot them. You might vaguely remember that, decades earlier, you first heard that was going to happen from some guy in a YouTube video. That is the real 2 degrees warming scenario. And the most terrifying part about this? That's the good outcome. The best that we could still realistically achieve if we immediately took drastic action on climate change right now. This is what was actually committed to over the 1.5 goal by most nations in the world at the Paris Climate Summit in 2015. If you're not already somehow scared and angered by this, then consider 2 more things. First, as Kyrgyzstan does at least acknowledge at the end of their video, we're currently actually well on the path to 3 degrees of warming, which will be so much worse than the already horrible scenario that I just outlined that it's really more accurately described as the apocalypse scenario that they claimed would only occur between 4 and 8 degrees of warming. And second, this 3 degrees of warming will occur even if every country in the world abides by their Paris Agreement commitments perfectly. The agreement that was supposed to keep temperatures temperatures below at least 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels and aim for below 1.5 degrees, didn't even actually try to do anything of the sort. Very few countries have even met the obligations that they agreed to in Paris. In the developed world, only the European Union and the UK are on track to meet their obligations.
Okay, so we're going to be missed in US, Japan, and Canada, which, I mean, at that point, just give up, because, like seriously. EU and the UK and South Africa. I'll go be on track. There's no mention of China, oddly.
This doesn't count their offloading of emissions to imports from the third world, along with some countries in the developing world. That's about a dozen out of 193 parties. So even in the current best possible scenario, which really isn't that possible at all, where they all somehow get their shit together and meet their Paris Climate Agreement targets within like 3 years or so, we'll still see levels of warming over pre-industrial levels of around 3 degrees Celsius. And since the Paris Agreement came into force in 2015, which was already very late, and 7 more years have passed since then at the time of me recording this, and fighting climate change is a very time-sensitive, time-limited thing, the situation now is all the bleaker. The time to take decisive action has long passed, and anything that we do from now will only really serve to make an already bleak situation a bit less bleaker. We're definitely not going to be fixing climate change. It's still absolutely worth doing everything possible, since obviously the alternative of nothing will just result in things being even worse, but this future is certainly not anything to get hopeful about.
So there's an additional, and this is probably one of the reasons why some people are reacting negatively to the Bad Empanada video, and I kind of see this too. One of the problems with this message is not that it's untrue, it's that a true message doesn't necessarily spur appropriate responses. And if you have people already thinking, well, the future's already going to result in hundreds of thousands of deaths, or millions of deaths, or the displacement over 1 billion people, it's like, you very quickly sink into a mode of just total disinterest, because you're not likely going to live long enough for you directly, especially as you're somebody with actual power to influence this. And the fact of the matter is you probably actually do have very little power to do so on an individual level. Your tendency will be, in all likelihood, to just kind of, well, fuck, and then just go back to your video games. Or whatever, right? Now, I don't know what the solution to that is. Maybe there isn't one, but it's because the problem is, like, he's totally correct. Like, there's nothing he's presented, despite it being extremely pessimistic. Maybe not even pessimistic, maybe even optimistic in certain ways. Despite that, we don't generally respond to crises by just throwing all of our resources at fixing them. More often than not, it's like when you, like, even think of stuff that you have like a direct personal interest in. People procrastinate about their homework for college courses that they enjoy and subjects that they're fascinated by. They'll read in for pleasure that they are paying thousands and thousands of dollars to attend. They'll blow that off until the last minute, and their marks will suffer for it. We don't respond appropriately to things like this unless we have a huge amount of positive pressures behind us, or a massive amount of negative pressures, like you're going to fail if you don't get this in now. And now all of a sudden in the last 2 days you've now worked for 40 plus hours on this essay, right? So yeah, but is that any better than, well, I'm an optimist, we'll figure something out, and then going back to playing video games? I don't know. I mean, like, I guess not if the result is the same. That's the thing. I'm not saying, like, Bad Empanada is doing anything wrong here. It's just, like, I'm listening to this and I'm realizing that the effect of this will not be to spur people to action. I'm not entirely certain that there is something that will. Like, it might not be the kind of thing that can sort of emerge bottom up. Which is a problem, because it's almost certainly at this juncture not going to come from the top down. So, this is one of the things we'll have to think about, I suppose.
That's like being hopeful for the future of your relationship because your partner only beat you 9 times this week instead of 10. The 2 degree scenario is already locked in and inevitable. You should be scared. You should be angry. You should be asking serious questions about how such a massively important threat, which has been known since at least the 70s, could be allowed to simply run rampant like this until far too late. You should be wondering not only how your leaders allowed it to get this bad, and how they're still not doing anywhere near enough to mitigate it, but also about the adequacy of the political, social, and economic systems that govern our world, what they're really designed to do deep down, and if they might be impeding us in other areas too. You should be asking questions about the free market ideology that we've been fed for our entire lives, in which sweeping government regulation and control are taboo topics to even talk about, despite them being the only realistically possible way that climate change could have been confronted in the past.
Exactly. So he's 100% right here. It's basically the reflection of what I just said. So that's...
And the only possible way in which it could still be mitigated. More on that later. I don't think this video by Kurgazat wants you to ask these questions, and there's more later in their video that backs this. Its content actually wants the viewer to specifically avoid them, to maybe at most focus on the few bad actors who they're willing to scapegoat, like the fossil fuel companies who they actually do mention a few times, rather than anything that's really systemic. Instead, you're meant to feel a sense of optimism and hopefulness for a potentially bright future that by any honest assessment of the evidence has absolutely zero chance of existing. Hence the downplaying in their outline of potential warming scenarios. Because the ridiculous idea that you should be feeling anything resembling a positive emotion about this falls apart if you even come close to acknowledging the reality. Now, they definitely do present the potential warming scenarios as bad and undesirable, but not even remotely to an accurate extent. Nor are they honest about the fact that we're definitely not going to be able to achieve even the incredibly low bar of keeping the temperature below the semi-apocalyptic scenario of just 2 degrees Celsius that they also downplay. To really drive this point home, let's quickly go over their summary of the 2 degree scenario again.
Warming beyond 2 degrees makes all of these extremes more extreme. Extreme weather events more common, with more ecosystems under major pressure. Some will not survive.
Extreme weather events will be more common, with no mention of what this will actually mean in terms of human consequences. Ecosystems will be under pressure and some will not survive.
Not just more common, they'll be more extreme, which is a major additional factor. Like, it's not just more heat waves, it's heat waves the likes of which you have never seen. That heat wave last year, by the way, like, you think when you hear heat wave, you think, oh, the sun was really hot, and it was just you know, people got heat stroke, and you think of like how you feel on like a normal summer day when you forget to drink enough water and you run too far at track or whatever. It was like sticking your hand into an oven going outdoors. I have never experienced heat like that in my life. It cooked your skin. It was unreal. Like, oh my god. If you have a convection oven at home, set it to about 200 degrees, wait till it's at maximum temperature, and hold your hand in front of the door. That's what it felt like all over your body, and the heat was coming from the ground as well as from the air. It was insane. Shade did nothing. There were frog ponds around our place that would croak all the time when you walked by in the spring. They were boiled. Like, good God. It is going to become a condition of surviving a season that you have a multi-$1,000 air conditioner in your building. That's where we're at right now.
That is an incredibly weird framing. In this scenario, at least hundreds of millions of people will die, billions more will suffer, and the highly interconnected world of today will, for all intents and purposes, no longer exist. Yet they give absolutely no hint of any of that. That's it. That's their whole summary of the 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels of warming scenario. 2 bullet points that don't even come close to honestly communicating the real gravity of what's going to happen. A video with the premise of convincing the viewer that we will fix climate change that glosses so badly over the full extent of its horrific, locked-in effects in service of that untenable conclusion can only be taken as a particularly egregious case of lying by omission. Something's going on here. Let's move on now. From here, they present the evidence for their argument, which is very wanting and does absolutely nothing to make the future look less bleak. It's one big gish gallop, a bunch of out-of-context factoids, sometimes false, sometimes true, always misleading, and always nowhere near as important as they're making them out to be, all thrown out in very quick succession. Together, they might overwhelm people into thinking that the point has been proven through pure information overload, but it's clear that they actually do nothing of the sort when closely examined.
If current climate policies stagnate, we're likely to end up with warming of around 3 degrees Celsius by 2100, which is scary and tragic and far from acceptable. But this is actually good news.
To say that only 3 degrees of warming is good news, when it'd be like 2 or 3 times worse than the already horrid 2 degree scenario that I just outlined, is really stretching the definition of good news. But let's see how they justify that.
How? In the last decade, we've seen enough progress that most scientists now think that we have likely avoided apocalyptic climate change. Although substantial risk still remains, we can pretty confidently say that humanity isn't going anywhere. Civilization might have to change, but it will endure.
So humanity won't be literally wiped out. Great. Humanity wouldn't literally be wiped out in a global thermonuclear war either. But I'm pretty sure we all still want to avoid it, aside from Jay Posadas, and anyone framing it not being the literal, complete end of all civilization forever as something to be hopeful about would be very suspect, right? They're vastly exaggerating here in order to present the still grim reality as something to be hopeful about. The actual complete end of the human race, of civilization, of the planet, etc. was never really a serious concern. But the reality of the future that we're facing, even in an ideal scenario of 2 degrees of warming, is still so grim that they need the reader to believe that simply avoiding actual straight-up extinction is something to, celebrate, to get hopeful about. It's not. Good news, everyone. We're not all going to die. Only hundreds of millions and possibly billions will. And the world will be a far more dreadful place for most of those who remain. You've got to be an utter psycho to frame it like that. Sorry, I was trying to be civil here, but it's really impossible. I can't...
By the way, here's an example of white supremacy that is entirely systemic and not actually based upon any hate for non-white people. This is one of the reasons why people talk in those terms. Because the fact of the matter is, what we're really saying here, when we're saying like 1 billion people will be displaced, is not that the majority of people in I guess capitalist metropoles will be displaced. We're talking about people who are largely in these countries that are going to be superheating first. That we largely outsource our production and our waste to.
Undo it.
You probably know this story. The last decade has been an immense failure for climate policies around the world. Instead of passing comprehensive, binding bills that would meaningfully reduce emissions, we mostly did nothing. A lost decade with one negative record after another.
You watch the Kurtz video, did they cite that claim that most scientists agree that we've avoided apocalypse? Let's take a quick look, actually. I'm a little bit curious. We are now in phase 4 in the public debate against rapid climate change action. They don't link it. There's no efficient table of contents here. It's like a super spread out document that's going to take forever to go through. Like look at a single graph takes up the entire page on my end. Like that's not cut off on your side. So this is going to take a little while to actually go through. We will at some point, but it's so badly put together. Oh wait, it's the wrong one. Here we go.
And this story is true, and it's one reason why so many people are giving up. But it is not the whole picture.
So this is where they start trying to back up their case for hopefulness by presenting...
Are you able to just control F it? The statements in the document aren't the same as in the video. Is the problem? It literally doesn't correspond to the video itself. It's a mess.
Completely inconsequential developments is far more important than they are. I'm going to play this...
If you want to search for it while we're going through this, that might save us some time. I just don't have time to go through it right now because it's already 5:23 and we want to actually get to some documents quickly.
Next part of the video for a few minutes straight with no interruptions, because showing that none of it really matters is very simple and I can address it all at once. Very convenient.
Despite the lack of climate policies and ongoing lobbying and misinformation campaigns from the fossil fuel industries, there was a lot of progress. Let's go back 20 years to see why today is so different. Between 2000 and 2010, greenhouse gas emissions had grown by 24%, 3 times as much as the increase in the previous decade. Subsidies for fossil fuels aimed at promoting economic growth caused a colossal increase in their consumption. For developing countries like China and India, coal was the cheapest fuel for growth, while rich countries showed little interest in changing their ways. In 2010, many people expected these trends to continue. Instead of decreasing fossil fuel use, its consumption would rise. The next decade turned out to be very different, though. First of all, coal burning in developing countries like India has slowed down or leveled off, like in China, and it's plummeted in rich countries like the UK and US. Since 2015, 3/4 of planned coal plants have been cancelled and 44 countries have committed to stop building them. 10 years ago, that would have seemed like wishful thinking, but today we can say with confidence, coal is dying. It's just not competitive anymore, because technologies we thought would remain expensive matured rapidly instead. Renewable electricity has shown explosive progress.
I'm fairly certain that's objectively wrong. Coal is no longer competitive. I don't. That's not true at all.
In a mere decade, wind energy got 3 times cheaper. Solar electricity is now 10 times cheaper. Cheaper than coal or any other fossil fuel burning power plant, despite the massive subsidies and global infrastructure propping up fossil fuels. 25 times more solar and nearly 5 times more wind electricity is produced today compared with 10 years ago, which is of course not nearly enough. One of the biggest obstacles is the variability of their power output. Renewables need a lot of energy storage to be a reliable power source, like expensive batteries. Amazingly, battery prices have decreased by 97% in the past 30 years, 60% in the last decade alone, which will serve all kinds of green technology like electric cars. You might say, well, that's great, but didn't Kurzgesagt's last climate video say that while wind and solar are nice, we need nothing less than a fundamental transition of our global industrial system? Yes, but luckily the shift goes beyond just the energy sector. Throughout the economy, people are working on improving current technology to lower emissions. We're rapidly replacing old incandescent light bulbs with LEDs that are 10 times more efficient. In 2020, about 7 out of 10 new cars in Norway were electric or hybrid. In 2021, it was already 8 out of 10. And the list goes on, from electric heating and better insulation to ships traveling at half speed to save fuel. Wherever you look, you find scientists, engineers, and entrepreneurs trying to solve some aspect of climate change. Enormous amounts of human ingenuity are being brought to bear on this problem, with more and more people deciding to prioritize preventing rapid climate change. Solutions for low-carbon production of cement, electronics, and steel, and innovations like artificial meat and carbon capture are in the works. The more of these technologies we deploy, the cheaper new and better technology gets. The cheaper they get, the more people use them, and so on.
That was really the crux of this video, and I think the crux of the ideology of this channel. They're trying to present it basically as if the market is fixing things through technological innovation, despite them being hampered by dastardly government interference in the economy, like fossil fuel subsidies. Entrepreneurs in the market are innovating, resulting in the spread of renewable energy and the upcoming death of fossil fuels such as coal. But the reality is, regardless of how many graphs they put on the screen, regardless of all these innovations, regardless of how much the price of commodified energy sources go down, global greenhouse gas emissions today are still rising at the same rate as in previous decades, the exact same if not worse, as the latest Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change or IPCC report showed. This graph ends in 2019, but this trend has continued since, with emissions continuing to rise in 2021, especially from coal, which they claimed was dying. Bit dishonest there, guys. Everything they mentioned has quite...
Yeah, the graph about Chinese coal use made no sense. So they showed how it was plateauing, and I'm assuming, again, for argument's sake, that their measurements are correct on that. It's kind of like if you're in a chamber and it starts filling with gas, and it gets like to a lethal peak, and then suddenly you hear over the microphone, no, it's okay, it's plateaued. But there's still that same level, like filling the room, right? Like that doesn't make any sense. The consequences of there being more gas being injected into the system, which is, I guess is a direct analogy here, don't go away just because the rate at which that gas is being introduced has leveled off. It's still increasing.
It's simply been completely inconsequential. It literally has not mattered at all. It's done nothing. None of it has even made a little dent in global emissions. It's been good for the people who've managed to make a lot of money off these new markets and who still stand to make a lot more, especially since they can market themselves as if they're selfless geniuses saving the world, but that's really about it. None of these slow adaptations of the market have even come close to doing anything really worth mentioning to fix climate change. Actually, fixing climate change, or at least heavily mitigating it, could only happen through very directed and immediate action, which a bunch of companies just trying to make a profit in the market aren't capable of doing. And the data presented by Kurzgesagt here shows us that
This is also why we are front-loading this before the critique of liberalism research that we're going to do. Sorry, George, for pausing your face like that. I will, however, be using that for future thumbnails. If you get on my nerves, be advised.
Clearly, because despite their barrage of out-of-context factoids presented as reasons to be hopeful, the outlook is still just as bad. None of it matters. Global greenhouse gas emissions needed to start going down a long time ago if we were to stay below the 1.5 degrees of warming target and avoid some of the more severe consequences of climate change. They did not. Since they didn't, now greenhouse gas emissions need to start going down literally immediately if we're to limit warming to only 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels and only face the nightmare scenario that I outlined earlier. But they're continuing to increase exactly as they have for decades.
I've got it. Get rid of plastic straws. So simple.
And this won't stop even if we all go out and buy solar panels and electric cars for 10 times cheaper than what they used to be. Nothing that they've gone over here should make you hopeful, because none of it has changed a single goddamn thing. That's the cold hard truth. It sucks, and it's scary, and you might not want to hear it, but it's still the truth, and downplaying it isn't going to help anything.
We can see the impact already. The domestic CO2 output of rich countries is falling.
So that's the sweet spot you need to hit. You need to somehow compel people to action by making them genuinely nervous without making them indifferent to an incoming catastrophe, because we can very easily become indifferent to an incoming catastrophe. By the same token, if we're hopeful, and this is where I absolutely agree, this critique of the Kurdzgesat video, is that you've become equally complacent, because it's like, oh, it's okay, it'll get sorted. And I just work like a 7 to 4 job. I'm not going to be the one doing this. I can just ignore this. This will get taken care of.
Without a major recession. Since the year 2000, the EU as a whole shows a 21% decrease, Italy 28%, the UK 35%, Denmark 43%.
More the narrative that free market forces are fixing things themselves. It's true that emissions have gone down across the EU over the last 20 years, but this has been inconsequential overall, as the fact that global emissions continue to rise shows. Climate change is a global problem, one that needed to be confronted decisively a long time ago. There was a very limited time frame of action, and we're pretty much well past it. That the very best performance on emissions reductions that they could point out was the EU, one of the world's richest regions and still one of the world's worst per capita emitters. Only managing a very slight improvement over such a long period should not be a cause for hope. It should be a cause for concern.
But the best news may be that emissions are no longer necessarily coupled with economic growth. In the past, this was an inconvenient truth. To get richer, you had to emit more, which led to fierce arguments between developing and developed countries about the fairness of reducing emissions while their populations were still poor. But in the last decade, we've seen that it is possible to increase prosperity without increasing emissions. Emissions in the Czech Republic dropped 13%, while their GDP grew by 27%. France reduced their CO2 emissions by 14%, while increasing GDP by 15%.
Yeah, so my reading of this was just a basic equivocation between correlation and causation, which they teach you in grade in first year sociology. You need to avoid, right? This is basic. Just because two things happen at the same time does not mean that they have a causal relationship with each other, or that they directly correlate in that way, where it's like, oh, we've switched to more renewable energy, therefore our profits have gone up. Like, you need to show, if that's the case, you need to show why, or you need to show like what mechanisms are responsible for each, so you can determine if, well, actually maybe there is no relationship, maybe it's incidental, or maybe they are related, but again, we've localized our examples to only those countries that are benefiting from this, and it may be the case that other places are doing much worse as a result, because it is a global economy. We aren't just talking about little isolated space habitats, right? Like, we rely upon our relationships of trade in order to have these levels of prosperity to begin with. And it's only 4 countries, so it's an impoverished sample size to begin with. And they're not exactly the most important.
Romania saw an 8% decrease and 35% growth. And even the largest economy on Earth, the USA, decreased emissions by 4% while growing their GDP by 26%.
Okay, but they did not grow their GDP by 26% because they reduced their emissions by 4%. That's preposterous.
Some of you may call this...
Also, you might have noticed as well that there's no consistency across the board for this purported correlation. Like, it's random. There's no correspondence between the amount of emissions reduced and the amount of GDP growth. Like, it's just a nonsense graph. Well, it's not a nonsense graph. It doesn't tell you anything useful by itself. It certainly doesn't get you to the conclusion that they're pushing.
It's a numbers trick, that rich countries are just exporting emissions to poorer nations by moving the dirty parts of their economies like manufacturing. But even when we account for all of our imported goods, the numbers still look positive. It's no longer a matter of having to choose between prosperity and the climate, as it seemed to be a decade ago. Developing countries will profit from that because as rich countries pay for the expensive development of green technologies, they can adopt them more cheaply. They can skip most of the high emission phase that today's rich countries went through.
They continue to point solely to rich countries in their examples throughout this part, continuing to frame it in terms of market forces solving problems, using some of the most generic propagandistic terminology imaginable while doing so. I don't want to get too far off topic here with a rant about the inadequacy of economic measurements, but to equate raw GDP going up, not even GDP per capita, just raw GDP, with prosperity increasing is absolutely indefensible. They straight up use those two things as synonyms, basically. They present them as if they are one and the same, like their point has been proven and there's just no more elaboration needed. It's such a bullshit trick. Raw GDP going up does not mean increased prosperity if prosperity is even a thing that you could measure. Not even close. It's at very most possible for there to be some correlation, but the only thing that you can actually be sure of about that statistic is that some corporations somewhere are now making more money, or that population simply rose, so each individual isn't actually any better off at all. GDP can and often does go up, while the living standards for normal people remain the same or get worse. In the US, for example, GDP on both a per capita and raw basis has increased massively since the 70s, yet wages, adjusted for inflation, have stagnated completely, meaning the average person isn't actually better off economically at all, even as businesses make more money than ever before.
Actually, worse
clearly,
off.
prosperity has not actually increased for most people,
That's why you can't buy houses.
as all that juicy extra GDP
And increasingly can barely pay rent.
is pure corporate profit. But still, the statistics that they present to argue that point here, even ignoring literally everything that I just said, are just plain bullshit. They're actually just knowingly lying here. Most of those countries' GDPs either have not grown at all or haven't grown nearly as much as they say. Rather, this is just them recovering from the 2008 economic crisis. The Czech Republic's GDP is at the same level that it was in 2008, before it dropped rapidly in 2009, the point that they curiously chose to start with. And its population has risen during this period, meaning that its GDP per capita has actually gone down. France's GDP is actually lower now than it was in both 2008 and 2009, so I got no idea where they got a 15% increase from. Romania did see an increase in GDP, though much lower than 35%, since they of course slyly used 2009 as a starting point rather than 2008, before the huge dip in the graph. The only one of these examples that they're being honest about is the US, whose GDP increase they accurately depict. The worst part is that they were absolutely 100% aware of this. It wasn't an honest mistake, it was an intentional trick. In the additional document where they provide extra context
here we
and
go.
their sources, they mention the global recession, so they definitely knew about the manipulative nature of using 2009 as a starting point over 2008. In fact, in this document, they actually state a very inconvenient fact, which they didn't mention in the video.
Domestic CO2 output of rich countries is failing without a major recession. This is most likely related to the global Great Recession. Yeah, I noticed that too. I was like, really?
That emissions went down in the EU in the last decade is in significant part due to reduction in economic activity caused by the economic crisis, not so much due to actual intentional action to fight climate change. This was replicated in the US, where human action was hailed in the media as the cause of reduced emissions after the recession, before a later study found that it was actually caused by the recession-induced reduction in all economic activity. So not conscious measures to fight climate change, but actually quite significantly just a huge accident. Still, I want to make very clear here that they're just making a terrible argument for a point that is at least half true. Moving to renewable and
What is up with Empanada's dead soul? He doesn't have dead soulless eyes. He looks normal. What do you... He's just looking at the camera, that's all. You know his dead soulless eyes is that, frick, what's his name? That guy I hate. Like nothing else. He just rubs me the wrong way and his videos are bullshit. One moment. Ryan Chapman. Those are soulless eyes.
nuclear energy without hurting living standards is absolutely 100% possible.
Soulless eyes combined with the manner of a kindergarten student reciting a poem on stage.
At least in industrialized developed nations. Where they fall flat is in the other half of this point, that this will somehow be easy to replicate in the developing world because the invisible hand of the market has lowered the price of renewable energy. That's simply not how this works. There's much more to a renewable energy transition than just prices, and using relatively insignificant emissions reductions in rich countries as an example of how poor countries could do the same is very misleading. It's infinitely easier for rich countries to make this transition, partly because they can afford to, but also mostly due to structural reasons. They already have well-developed energy grids which renewables can easily slot into. Most poor countries don't even have reliable fossil fuel-powered energy infrastructure from which to build off. Rich countries have an abundance of the engineers, scientists, technicians, and other workers who are capable of developing and maintaining these sorts of projects, and the education systems necessary for producing more of them. Poor countries, comparatively, do not. Worse, a big part of why this is the case is that those with the interest and means to study in these fields are often poached by richer countries.
Have I reviewed Ryan Chapman's videos? I reviewed his one on Chinese philosophy a little while ago.
Countries also have no or a relatively undeveloped industrial sector, meaning they have little to no chance of being able to produce things like wind turbines or solar panels.
Let me scan this quickly. Lack expertise, right? Yeah, it's simpler to burn fossil fuels than it is to network yourself into a massive electric grid that's connected to renewable sources. That's obvious.
Locally. So even if they just randomly decided to start building a bunch of renewable energy infrastructure, despite not having any of the prerequisites in place, they'd have to export their primary products to rich countries in order to pay for imports of renewable energy infrastructure, which they'd also buy from those same rich countries. Regardless of how cheap renewables get, all that you're really doing there is reproducing the same cycles of economic dependency that got us here in the first place.
Yeah.
And that does and will continue to keep these countries poor, just with a greenwash veneer.
Yeah, that's on point. That's on point. That's on point. That's on point. When's the Mr. Girl Talk? That's on Thursday at 6 p.m., I believe, PST.
So much more to this than just corporations sell renewables for cheaper. So poor countries are easily going to be able to make the transition too. That's just not how it works, and it's not how it's going to work. The obstacles are not simply of price, and have a whole lot to do with the historical and current exploitations of the poorer countries by rich ones. Almost every country that is today classified as developed literally directly colonized most of the countries that are classified as developing, in many cases until quite recently, and in some cases they still literally do have colonies. But Kyrgyzstan's market ideology can't acknowledge this. It's completely incompatible with acknowledging them actually, because that would require them to acknowledge that their own prescriptions are responsible for all of this in the first place. So instead they stick to the most simplistic, generic assertion imaginable. Companies sell more, price goes down, problem solved. That's not only not going to happen, but even if we lived in the simplistic world where it did, it wouldn't come nearly fast enough to actually make a difference. It's already too late.
We are at the point where not decarbonising is a bad business decision.
If not decarbonizing was bad for business, meaning bad for profits,
they would do
then
it.
Obviously, global emissions would not still be rising. The reason why the market hasn't done anything to curb still rising global emissions is because burning fossil fuels just still is good for business. It's that simple, and they haven't provided here anything that even resembles adequate evidence for their assertion otherwise. Their narrative here is the generic neoliberal one, that market competition, fostered by governments when necessary but otherwise left to be as free as possible, will simply correct problems all by itself, and that in this case it's even already done so. But capitalist profit-seeking and their influence and control over governments, which goes far beyond just the fossil fuel industry, is the cause of this problem. It's perpetuating this problem, and just continuing to leave them mostly to their own devices, aside from having maybe like an inconsequential carbon tax here and there, and a teensy little bit of regulation to make it look like you're doing something, is absolutely not going to solve it. Nor has it come close to doing so. Over the last few decades, as emissions have risen and risen, so have profits. Today, far more wealth is concentrated in the hands of rich investors and owners than ever before in history. 1% of the world's population, all of the millionaires, own nearly half of global wealth. That some capitalists are now profiting a bit more from selling renewables, and that a limited selection of rich countries have slightly lowered their emissions over the last couple of decades, does absolutely nothing to support this idea that not decarbonizing is bad for business. The evidence actually makes it clear that the exact opposite is true. The world is ending, and business is booming.
And we haven't even really talked about solutions like carbon capture. In 2000, it didn't really exist. In 2022, that technology does exist and costs around $600 to remove 1 ton of CO2 from the atmosphere. As investment pours in and the technology matures and begins to scale, it's likely that these costs will plummet over the next few decades.
This is mostly just in there as another addition to the Gish Gallop, but it's interesting in that it's something that is completely incompatible with the market solutions that this video is largely trying to push. No business is going to purchase a carbon removal service out of the good of their hearts, because they simply get nothing out of it. By the time any practical and profitable business use for captured carbon surfaces will already have been fucked for decades. So the only market for this technology will be parties who aren't seeking to profit from the investment, leaving governments. And with the complete inaction of world governments up until this point, it's safe to say that they're not going to come together and put the needed trillions of dollars of investment towards developing and implementing this technology before it's already far too late. Especially since too late means within like 8 years or so. So this is again just totally irrelevant. And that concludes all the evidence that they present for their idea that you should be hopeful that we will fix climate change. Absolutely nothing of any consequence at all. After this, they kind of euphemistically admit that everything that they just went over doesn't actually matter at all without outright saying it. So you kind of have to wonder why they made this video, why they're trying to spread this narrative. And I think there's a lot of insight to that in this statement.
And now imagine if all of this was achieved without proper financial and political support, and despite fossil fuel lobbying, just think what humanity can do when climate change finally gets the political attention and funding it needs.
That's the narrative right there. All of these supposedly amazing achievements that they present have happened purely thanks to the forces of the market, with no help from governments. In fact, according to them, governments have, if anything, just impeded this process, with their subsidies to the one singular group of capitalists that Kyrgyzstan is actually willing to blame, the fossil fuel industry. So the problem, according to them, is not capitalists in general defending their own interests and impeding governments from being able to take meaningful action even if they wanted to. It's rather just governments and then the one group of bad capitalists. Nothing else. If governments just stopped helping the wrong bad capitalists and instead helped the right good capitalists, everything would be fixed. That's the whole message of this video, and I think I've already shown pretty damn well that it's baloney.
So is it okay to feel hopeful again? The situation
If I start going on a Twitch regularly, I'm gonna use that as an audio clip. Just baloney, just him saying that.
is still dire and serious, so what's the point of focusing on this side of the story? The trap of hopelessness. Climate change can feel overwhelming and make your future seem bleak. The sadness and hopelessness that many people feel is real and very destructive because it causes apathy. Apathy that is only serving the fossil fuel industry that is still delaying change however it can.
Sorry, I just have to interject here. Always the fossil fuel industry, nothing else. That's the only business sector they're willing to put any blame on.
In a sense, they have weaponized hopelessness. We are now in phase 4 in the public debate about rapid climate change action. Phase 1 was, climate change is not real. Phase 2 was, climate change is real, but not caused by humans. Phase 3 was, climate change may be caused by humans, but it's not that bad. Phase 4 is, climate change is no longer avoidable. We are doomed, and it doesn't matter what we do.
Those phases really just don't coincide with reality. The idea that we went straight from climate change isn't that bad, so we should do nothing, to climate change is unavoidable, so we should do nothing, is just wrong. Climate change has been pretty overwhelmingly accepted as something that is both real and that we really, really badly need to do something about since at least like the late 90s. And even more so today, from at least the center-right to the left, the consensus is unanimous, at least in terms of like lip service. Obviously, there's a lot of politicians who acknowledge it and say they want to do something and then just don't do shit. So these phases do not reflect reality at all. In fact, they've pretty much invented their own version of reality here to give them an excuse to make this video. A video that itself heavily downplays the actual reality of what we're facing, and that, ironically, itself might also inspire complacency and thus inaction.
If we want the world to change, we first need to believe that change is possible, and we have an abundance of evidence that it is. Changes to our industrial system.
Now, this part's true. If you want to actually spur a mass response, if you want to motivate people to agitate for positive change, then there needs to be an assumption, there needs to be some level of confidence that change is possible. We talk about this with economic inequality too, like generally. When we talk about economic inequality as a problem to be solved, we're generally talking about people who already have either some level of buy-in to basically matter in that calculus for the stability of communities. We don't typically talk about economic inequality in terms of totally displaced peoples or homeless people or refugees or things like that. Typically, we're talking about low-income citizens, high-income citizens, people with jobs who are able to positively engage within some economic sphere, right? Our tendency is to regard people who operate outside of a certain realm of efficacy, or anything that's outside of a certain realm of efficacy, as just outside of our concern. Because at the very least, on an individual level, we seem to be able to socially get away with it. So I don't think, like, Kyrgyzstan's not wrong here, but they're also themselves, they seem to be weaponizing that point in favor of, in the defense of shoddily defended claims, which is actually a lot more damaging, because now people look at responses to this, and they look into the data themselves, the people who are actually interested in who are motivated to actually try to address this. And they see all of the data weighing against it. And they came in hopeful, and their hopes are dashed, and now they are potentially more apathetic, or more doomer, as this video goes.
System are gaining momentum. Technology gets better and cheaper. Climate change has become a key issue in most free elections.
And none of that matters. It's not even a start. Things are still getting worse, and that should make you angry, not hopeful. They've presented absolutely nothing to be hopeful about here.
As more and more younger people move into influence.
Like, there's an additional problem that both of these, both Bad Empanada and Kyrgyzstan are talking about that's very relevant, and they're both talking about it in otherwise valid ways. The problem is that Kyrgyzstan appears to be bullshitting a lot of their data besides, which makes them a negative actor on that. There's sort of an economy of morale here that needs to be dealt with. insofar as, again, you're relying at all on the common viewer, the common viewer's takeaway from this video having any sort of potential effect, whether directly or at a massive remove, like just deciding in future to vote in favor of the most climate conscious politician or whatever. Like, at a certain level, it does seem kind of futile regardless. It's just kind of like a best shot kind of thing. That change also needs to be realistic. Most people can't envision change past 2 generations. You need to mobilize them to see the change happening now or in their children's lives. Most people, like, look, I was born in the 90s, so I couldn't envision the changes that took place over the past 20 years. I don't think most people could. For God's sake, look at how look at science fiction movies from the 70s. Forget about generations. We have no clue what the future is going to look like. People who spend huge parts of their lives doing nothing but thinking about the future have no idea. Oh, hi, Echo. We're just looking at we're getting our bearings on climate change research. We're watching. We watched Kurzgesagt's Kurzgesagt's video on We Will Fix Climate Change, and now we're watching the illustrious Bad Empanada's video response to it, which is actually so far pretty good.
Influential positions, they prioritize climate change and work on new solutions.
This image, it's just such an amazing encapsulation of the ideology at play here. A kid with a skateboard who's apparently like a 12-year-old CEO entrepreneur doing his grind set, giving a tech bro style presentation about his company's green energy products. Oh my god, man. Here's the stark reality, okay? Young people being in influential positions in companies that are seeking to profit from green-branded technologies is not going to do a single thing to meaningfully reduce global emissions, just like it hasn't done up until today. Elon Musk isn't going to save us, nor does he want to. And 12-year-old skateboarder Elon Musk isn't going to save us either, okay?
In 2022, most governments not only acknowledge it, but set their own net zero goals in democratic and autocratic countries.
Indeed they have. But none of their goals are adequate. The earliest targets set are for 2045 and the latest for 2070, far too late for less than around 3 degrees of warming, and few, if any of them, will even come close to actually meeting these targets, as they're simply not taking the necessary action, and mostly just hoping that market mechanisms with slight government nudges fix the problem magically, as always. Also, these pledges are mostly worthless, including those that have actually been signed into law. At no point have governments ever meaningfully tackled climate change in the past, not even those that talk a big game about fighting it have. And there's no reason to believe that this is just going to suddenly change. In addition, in many countries, all that it would take is for one right-wing climate change denier to win an election to have all those goals abandoned and any progress made destroyed. And with the coming climate refugee crisis, which is going to perfectly fit into their pre-established anti-immigrant narratives, they're probably going to be winning some elections, I'm sorry to tell you, or just taking power in coups. Net zero emissions pledges are not only too little too late, but
which, by the way, is one of the reasons why I care about large channels in this platform carrying water for fascist actors, because that has downstream effects in the real world in a very real way that can have vast, far-reaching consequences.
But few, if any, of them will actually be adhered to. The economic system and its accompanying ideology is simply not fit for purpose.
The results of years of fighting a steep uphill battle are now clearly visible. The pressure needs to keep increasing to make sure that the promises made today are actually kept.
The results are really just not clearly visible at all, as we just went over. Though yes, the pressure does need to keep increasing, but not to make sure the promises made today are kept. The promises made today are garbage, and will result in a world that is even worse than the one that I outlined.
Okay, look, Bad Empanada, you're a smart guy. You understand this stuff. You know how the attention economy works. You know how political morale works. You like all this stuff. Stop harassing people on Twitter so that people can't just throw out your stuff. Because it's like, Jesus Christ, man. Like, just minimal level of prudence to reflect like your correctness on these issues, because you're undermining it.
Earlier, you need to get angry, you need to get furious, and you need to demand far more than what this channel right here would ever tell you to. They've promised a follow-up video to this one where they'll outline the solutions they think we should be advocating for, and it might actually already be out by the time that I upload this, because it's going to take me a while after filming to edit. And I can already tell you what they're going to say. Things like making it out like individual consumer choice does anything meaningful, getting governments to remove subsidies on fossil fuels, suggesting subsidies for private renewable energy companies, and carbon taxes or carbon trading markets. So just funneling money into private companies and hoping they do what's needed fast enough, and completely inadequate, market-based non-solutions that don't even approach the levels of decisive, direct government intervention that are needed. We're about 30 years past the point where those sorts of things might have even had a chance at being adequate.
Climate doomerism is the equivalent of giving up, even though you can still prevent not just the worst case, but also mitigate most of the bad things, make changes in time to adapt better, and prevent the poorest from suffering.
We absolutely cannot mitigate most of the bad things, okay? We can try to adapt to them as much as we can, sure, but they're coming. That's the sad reality. And sadly, we're also probably not going to prevent the poor from suffering. They already suffer, but it's going to get even worse for them.
I tried to watch this, but I wasn't impressed with this Kurtz cassette takedown. Bad Empanada isn't as privy as I am on this. Well, Serptive, by all means, we have a channel in the Discord. Please post your sources, and if you want to come on and chat sometime, we can absolutely do that.
Especially if developed countries, as pretty much all indications point to, do literally nothing to help. That's the reality of the situation, and downplaying it in the name of preventing hopelessness and apathy is even more dangerous than those emotions are.
That is why hopelessness and apathy are so dangerous. If the last in many ways wasted decade has shown anything, then it's that progress is being made.
It really just hasn't, man. Come on.
And that dire scenarios are just predictions, not our sealed fate. As of 2022, based on current global policies, we will end up in a 3 degrees world. Now it's our job to yet again prove the predictions wrong, despite how serious and urgent things are. To turn that 3 degrees into a 2 degrees, and then see where we can go from there.
Yeah, turn that 3 degrees into a 2 degrees. If that's even a remotely possible thing anymore, which I sadly doubt, let's try for it. It's at least better than nothing. But how about you don't lie about the grim reality of what that 2 degrees actually means? What they're saying here is, let's aim for this scenario where billions of poor people suffer and hundreds of millions of them die, while developed countries turn into like Starship Troopers, except communicated via optimistic euphemisms while generic inspirational music plays. It's absurd when you strip it down to what it really is. They're fake smiling at you and telling you to be hopeful 5 seconds before you're enveloped by the fireball approaching behind you.
For that, we need hope. And we hope we gave you that today.
I can send my notes in geology, natural gas, oil, and etc. if I can transfer them digitally, but I have the textbooks I use. Yeah, that'd be helpful, Max. Thank you.
At least a little. That you feel that things are serious, but also that you have a future. That you can have kids without dooming them or the world. That taking action today is worth it. And that despite powerful industries doing everything to delay it, society is changing. If you need a more concrete roadmap of what you can do personally, we're working on a follow-up video to talk about that in greater detail. Doomerism, inactivity, and weaponized hopelessness are the only trump cards left for the powers that don't want change. Don't let them win.
Okay, that's the end. Thank God. I want to note regarding the last thing they said there, they themselves are funded by the powers that don't want change. They received a $600,000 grant from literally Bill Gates in 2015. Bill Gates, one of the worst monopoly capitalists of the modern era. He gave them significantly more money than I've spent in my entire life. I didn't mention this earlier in the video because I didn't want to be accused of poisoning the well or anything, but I think now that we're done going through their entire video, it's very relevant information. It gives us context as to why they might have gone for a narrative like this one that heavily downplays the problem and overstates the significance of market-based developments and solutions. They probably weren't like literally told personally by Bill Gates to make this video or anything, though they have produced other videos with very interesting titles and arguments.
Last in the series, may possibly return from Bill Gates. Okay.
At the behest of the Gates Foundation in the past, but it does certainly seem like Gates thinks that the content of their channel aligns pretty well with his own goals, and that should be at least a little bit of a red flag. So let me finally conclude here. I
don't know anything about Gates's political goals, actually. That would be something useful to look into, just with respect to the Kurtz Gazette. I can never frickin' pronounce it. Kurtz Gazette. Okay, Kurtz Gazette.
Things to say about climate change and the future that we're facing that go beyond just rebuttals to this dumb video. For most of you watching this, climate change will not be the apocalypse. Most people who watch English language videos on YouTube are from the first world, developed world, global north, whatever you want to call it, and you guys will mostly be fine. Your countries are wealthy and industrialized enough to be able to adapt to 2, or maybe even 3, degrees of warming. Some of your coastal cities are at risk of being enveloped by the ocean, but you have the resources and the industry necessary to make seawalls to protect them, for example, or to plan evacuations and build the necessary housing further inland for the evacuees. You'll be hit by more frequent natural disasters, which will undoubtedly kill a lot of people, but you'll be able to deal reasonably well with their aftermath. Chances are you're not going to be dying yourself, and they won't come close to causing the actual collapse of your societies or anything like that. You'll face lower agricultural yield.
Yes, Bill Gates sucks. That doesn't mean climate change isn't really... He's not saying climate change isn't real. Nobody said that. Bad Empanada's pointing out that the sort of milquetoast no harsh action required attitude towards climate change is a little bit interesting, given that despite their demonizing of, or not demonizing, despite their specifically highlighting like billionaires and whatnot as the people weaponizing doomerism, they're receiving funds from somebody who I guess Banapanada is implying directly benefits from that dynamic. I'm a little bit unclear as to the details of that, though, so I'm going to have to research that more myself. The overpopulation talks and population growth talks are all the rage with billionaires, including Bill Gates. They deflect into overpopulation as the real problem, overdistribution. Okay, that makes sense. Gates is given more for climate research than either a billionaire. We need more billionaires like him. Not trying to say we should worship these people like Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, but damn, lol. Yeah, I'm gonna want to look into that, because just the bare fact that Bill Gates gave them money, I don't think is necessarily suspect by itself. Patrons can have more money than the people they patronize. It doesn't necessarily mean, like, you know, that's just not enough. Like, I need to know something about Bill Gates that would indicate that he has a vested interest in the message that they're putting there. My suspicion is that it's total disinterest. It's just like Bill Gates probably has some kind of grant thing you can apply for, and he has people who pick out channels and things that they allocate resources to. I know they responded to Banapanada. We'll look at that next.
But still,
We'll go a little
most of your
bit
countries will be able to adapt to
I'm
that. They'll
curious
still
what
be
the
capable
response
of
is.
feeding themselves from their own agricultural produce alone if they need to. Your living standards will surely go down, and your economies and societies will definitely
We'll look at the IPCC report tomorrow.
become far more insular as global supply chains collapse and antagonisms with other countries over resources increase. But as long as you scroll fast enough past the images of the refugees being mass murdered at your border, you'll be fine. Have kids if you want, just be aware that they're pretty much guaranteed to grow up as fascists who enthusiastically endorse the murder of those refugees who they're not going to consider to be human beings. Kurogazak kind of forgot to mention that part. I'd like to think that most of you watching have at least an ounce of empathy though, and would prefer to aim quite a bit higher than that, even if you personally will be okay. It's actually true that, as this video's title says, we will fix climate change, in a very sort of roundabout way.
Gates bought a ton of acres of farmland recently. Interesting. Bill Gates is in a disinformation war against 1 billion peasants. The money was for their videos about GMOs. That'd be interesting to see.
Eventually, the effect that humans have on global average temperatures is going to reach a peak, and the climate will stop changing due to human action. But that's not what they or anyone else means by fixing it. When we say that, we mean preventing its worst effects and avoiding that nightmarish scenario that I outlined earlier. And we really can't avoid it. We can't fix it. But we could mitigate it, and we could adapt to it. It would require huge cooperation between world governments that far eclipses anything that's ever happened in human history, and massive government economic interventions in practically every country in the world. Every developed nation would first need to ruthlessly nationalize their energy sector and force through an incredibly rapid transition to renewables and nuclear. They need to form masses of state companies a la the New Deal to implement massive green infrastructure projects as directly and as fast as possible, such as huge expansions of public transport networks. They all have enough money to do this easily. They just spend it on other far less important things. And most of them can literally print money anyway, man. Yeah, it'd cause a bit or even a lot of inflation. I think, you know, we can maybe deal with the inflation for a couple of years, okay? Developed nations could reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions within a decade. Easily, less than a decade if they did anything like this. That alone would reduce around 40% of the world's emissions. These countries would then need to do everything possible to help the developing world do the same thing in the shortest time frame possible. They need to send their engineers and scientists there, train the locals, pay for the exact same sort of state-led energy transition that they did at home, pay for exactly the same sorts of infrastructure projects.
Somehow do so in a manner that those countries can accept, because it wouldn't be a de facto allowance of these larger, more developed countries to just exercise total hegemony over their infrastructure. Like, this is you see how it gets really sketchy really fast?
And get them across the net zero line as well, without asking for anything in return. All of this could easily be done in just 15 to 20 years, as the example of the rebuilding of Western Europe after World War II very clearly shows. And yup, the developed world will have to pay for all or most of this. Developing countries simply don't have the wealth, the pre-existing structures, nor the industrial capacity to do this alone like the global north does. You might not think that's fair, but well, for one, climate change is global. It really doesn't matter if you think it's fair or not. Every country emits into the same atmosphere.
It's also directly the result of activities that became routinized and normalized globally as a direct result of the immoral actions of those developed quote-unquote countries, right? So it's actually kind of fair.
We're all in this together. As far as fighting climate change goes, you can't divide anything along the lines of borders, because the atmosphere certainly doesn't have any of them. If every single developed country rapidly transitions to carbon neutrality, and then the rest of the world is still left in the dust without the ability...
I believe the Gates Foundation tends to do a big, quote-unquote, addressing global problems-themed initiative once a year. A fair few creators get grants from that event. Yeah, okay.
do the same, then it was all for naught. Every country needs to reach net zero emissions and do it fast. Your only options here are to get it done yourself and then help out everyone else as much as possible, or accept climate catastrophe. And
I wonder if we could get a Bill Gates grant. Probably not. You probably need like a team and a company for that. Be worth looking into though.
for two, the developed world caused this problem in the first place. First through centuries of colonialism, which is what left the global south poor and destitute, and what made the global north countries rich, and what enabled them to industrialize in the first place. Then through emitting massive quantities of greenhouse gases through said industrialization. 79% of the man-made greenhouse gas emissions currently in the atmosphere.
What's going on with eco-modernist climate change fixes and organized science denial against agroecology is much more sophisticated and successful than climate denial. I'm not sure I follow subject. Can you like restate that so it's clear? I think I get what you're getting at, but I'm not sure.
Atmosphere accumulated over the last couple of centuries came from the developed world. So developed countries kind of owe it to everyone else to help out here, since they caused the problem. And they're also...
With almost 269,000 acres, Bill Gates retained his ranking as America's largest private farmland owner. My take is that the billionaires foresee the coming collapse and are planning their contingency. I think the Church of Mormon is also, or like the LDS Church is also a massive farmland owner in Europe, I think, if I'm not mistaken. It might just be property, but I thought it was... Actually, let me look that quickly. I'm a little bit curious. LDS Church property holdings. The Mormon Church reportedly owns over 1 million acres in continental America on which it runs farms, ranches, orchards, and hunting preserves. Yeah, so you're not just going to be fascists, you're going to be Mormons. Do you think it's worth it for left-leaning and or progressive people to get involved in the energy industry? I don't know. I'm not that kind of political scientist. I'm trying to become one, but I don't know. We'll have to look into that, won't we? That will hopefully we'll have some sense of our answer to that question, or questions like that, when we've delved into this a bit further.
So the cause of the inability of developing countries to deal with it themselves. So yeah, that's how we could fix climate change. Will we though? Almost certainly not, I'm sorry. And the narrative being presented in the Kurgazat video only serves to further ensure that outcome. They assert essentially that some private companies are doing amazing stuff about climate change. They're innovating left and right, while governments, if anything, are just impeding their CEO entrepreneur grind sets. But the reality is that it's the private sector, far beyond just the fossil fuel industry, through its collective pressure on and control of governments, who ensure that they will never, ever in a million years take the necessary state action that I just outlined, the decisive, directed action that is really needed to fight climate change. The same innovative entrepreneurs making their fortune off selling solar panels would be up in arms about the anti-free market precedent being set if any government dared to take the necessary action, such as nationalizing the energy sector, which would include them, or forming state companies to undertake a massive green infrastructure projects directly without giving the private sector their cut. Because they're not in it to save the world, they're in it to make money, and them continuing to make money is dependent on the core of the system being maintained with as little regulation and government involvement as possible. And it's the same for all companies, whether they're selling oil, sandwiches, or wind turbines. Even those who might not be exactly directly affected by such drastic government action would still mostly be against it because of the precedent being set that goes completely against their interest as a class and their accompanying ideology. Market forces may perhaps very gradually over the course of like a century replace fossil fuels with renewables. Electric cars might eventually totally replace fossil fuel burning ones. Your light bulb might even get more efficient. None of that matters at all though when it comes to fixing climate change, because that's already been happening, and yet global emissions, which needed to start going down more than a decade ago, have continued to rise.
I know I'm going to get a no ethical consumption under capitalism bullshit response, but for those of us in the developed world, stop eating milk reduces your footprint enough to pull a car off. I have a suspicion that there is somebody on the writing team for The Boys that is against milk consumption, and they have done a damn good job making it the most unappetizing food product in the world. Like, dear God, ugh, I shudder to think about it.
By the time the market could fix climate change, there wouldn't be a market left. As long as we're relying on this sort of magical thinking, this religious level dogma, to solve a problem that actually requires swift and decisive direct government action that conflicts heavily with the interests of the private sector, it's only going to get worse. Kurgazat seems to want viewers to walk away from their video thinking otherwise. That the only problem is with one specific industry and the incompetence of governments who just need to follow the lead of the same capitalists who, as a class, caused this problem in the first place. The market will surely fix it with just a little bit of government nudging, but not too much like actual direct intervention and decisive action. They're lying here, and doing so in a way that benefits the very people who are to blame for our inability to fight climate change. Not just the fossil fuel industry, but capitalists in general, who use their economic power and influence to ensure that governments don't even think about taking the necessary action to fight climate change, and ensure that it doesn't get any worse than the already horrible scenario that I outlined earlier. To have a channel that adheres to the very neoliberal capitalist ideology that locked us into this awful future in the first place, tell us to be hopeful about that, is just beyond the pale. This video is weaponized Steven Pinkerism. If you'll permit me to reference a 20-year-old meme, it's the Iraqi information minister of climate change videos. It's the sort of bullshit, toxic, reality-denying optimism that steers people away from the only genuine solutions. They claim to want to combat inaction on climate change, but if anything, they encourage it. Narratives like this, if accepted, are just going to result in the deaths of untold hundreds of millions more people than those who are already the guaranteed victims of climate change. Climate change which has been induced by the same rich countries that people spreading these sorts of narratives are from, and which will overwhelmingly affect people from countries which have nothing to do with the problem in comparison. As I got further and further into writing this script and then reading it off as I'm doing right now, it really hit me more and more that this was not like some honest mistake, just an error in fact-checking. Kurgazat was very knowingly dishonest here. This was a crafted propaganda piece. They're not just some regular YouTube channel, they're a production company with 50 employees. They have a CEO, investors like Mr. Bill Gates.
I have an alternative theory. I think they're doing what every YouTube sort of faux educational channel does, and they're swiftly putting together bullshit arguments because they get a huge amount of funds from the 8 million views they've gotten since April, since this went up. That's what I think is going on. It's like when PhilosophyTube cites a book she clearly hasn't read. When you have all of these, when you've got this Ryan Chapman douchebag explaining fascism, and he's literally just bullshitting a quick cliff notes of 5 or so things that he skimmed through for references. He has no conception of, first of all, the situation of these statements and the actual extant literature on the topic. Even in the context of the books as a whole, he has like the scantest reading of this possible, just enough to be able to produce the video, because otherwise that's lost time for him, because he doesn't care about actually knowing things. He's trying to produce a product quickly enough that he can make more than he's put in. I think that's probably more what's going on here than that, because like, okay, let's look at this staff for a second here. Who have we got? Philip Detmer, head writer, founder, and CEO. Chief Operating Officer, Chief Creative Officer, Executive Assistant, Head of People and Organization, People and Organization Generalist, Head of Illustration, Art Director. There are very few people here who are actually responsible for research. In fact, I would suspect almost none of them are responsible for research, because the head writer is also the CEO. He probably outsources a lot of his stuff the way I do. When I need to do research streams, I don't have a lot of time to go hunting these things down. I put out like a notice saying, hey, for people who are in the know on this topic, can you send me sources? And they do. I don't think he's vetted anything. I think he went, okay, well, we can put this, and this together and make a video out of that really quickly, and we'll make a bunch of money and it'll be great. And you can see they've got a big staff, so he has to do this to make payroll, right? Like, this is... You can't not make money doing this. So the need to publish or die, basically, in the YouTube sphere, guarantees that bad work is being pumped out constantly. Because it's not just a matter of doing research and presenting research and not receiving like damning criticism for your shoddiness. You need to produce stuff that is appealing to people who ultimately don't give a fuck if you're right or not. So it's like, I think saying that these are just shills for big business or for billionaires is maybe giving them too much credit. Like I think it's honestly it's the business. They just need to produce stuff fast, which means you can't constantly be questioning your thesis when you're halfway through. You have people producing art for this, right? And the rate at which they put out videos is too fast for them to be like, honestly, like, okay, we've read more papers and we've reassessed. We've been wrong about everything, guys. Here's new, because then nobody's going to watch your old video. You see the problem?
Everything. When they mislead like this, it's not the result of some honest mistake like what some independent YouTuber would make. It's very deliberate. They made this video the way it is because they wanted to make it like this. So yeah, this...
Yeah, but why did they want to make it that way? I don't think they wanted to make it that way because they're shills for Bill Gates. I think they wanted to make it that way because they already had a thesis going in, and they can't deviate from it without accruing a lot more costs, right? I know for a fact he does. He says so in a previous video. Who says so in a previous video? Who says what? What are we talking about? Have you ever gone over Chapman's fascism video? If so, where? Would love to see it. I haven't yet. I should, though, at some point.
Makes me angry, and that's good. I should be angry. You should be too. You should also be afraid, and maybe even a little bit hopeless. Those are completely rational emotions to be feeling about this. You should harness those emotions, and direct them to...
Leo, I've acknowledged the Kurds Gazette reply to Bad Empanada like 5 times now. I know. We'll watch it.
...towards something far more important than just one sly propaganda video on YouTube. In 1963, Nelson Mandela was put on trial by the white supremacist apartheid government of South Africa.
Oh, they've acknowledged that they contract their researchers. Yeah, I was certain that they were doing that. There's just no time.
Accused of being the leader of a violent terrorist group, the death penalty was on the table if he was convicted. When he was in the dock, rather than denying the charges against him, he faced down the judge who would decide his sentence and freely admitted that he was the leader of Umkhonto we Sizwe, an armed resistance group, and that he was even the one who ordered its creation. He freely admitted that he was behind the acts of sabotage for which he was accused. He explained that they had been forced on this path because their 50-year-long non-violent struggle for black civil rights had achieved absolutely nothing. Serious warnings about climate change first began in the 1970s. 5 decades ago. 50 years of protests and outcry since have gotten us nowhere. What choice have our governments and the capitalists they represent left us? What will you do? Thanks for watching.
My microphone's still muted. So here's the problem. Like big man Bad Empanada is going to be like, okay, well we've tried the peaceful options, right? It's not working. So maybe it's time we do stuff that's a little bit more serious to strong arm governments into taking action on this or whatever. But what begs the question, so what does he actually do then? Does he direct his resources towards networking with other influencers and with organizations to actually like work out solutions to problems or ways in which to brute force some kind of voice into what solutions are considered? Even if that amounts to taking violent action someplace down the line? No, he doesn't. Instead, he decides to attack people on Twitter and make himself look like a crazy person so that almost nobody, even if they agree with him, can positively cooperate with them, because to do so is to throw away your own credibility. Like, just don't. You know, like it's dumb. It's needless. It doesn't help you. All right, here we go. I'm gonna be right back. I'm gonna grab some more coffee, and then we'll we'll finish off watching this thing, or most of it. We'll see if it's worth it. Alright, I can't go long here because I need to wrap up soon. So we'll take a quick glance at this. We'll see what the nature of it is. And then we'll wrap up for today because we're already over time.
I posted my video shitting all over Kurz Gazette's video on feeling hopeful about the absolutely awful situation on climate change. I thought it was especially important to make that video because in order to feel that way, you just have to completely gloss over the third world. And that's what most people do. That's what all...
I don't need to see Banapana's response to this. I just want to see what the response by Kurz Gazette actually was.
This Western-centric political space always does. Gloss over the third world. Forget that they exist. At best, mention them in passing. But with how fucking awful climate change is for the third world, that video was just unconscionable. I couldn't let it slide. And Kurz Gazette found it. They literally left a comment responding to it within, like, I think it was within an hour of the upload. I only had like 2,000 views at the time. So I wonder how they even find it. Why they subscribed to me or something? I don't understand. It's just really weird that they found it so quickly. And they left a comment, or I think maybe the CEO left a comment. I'm not sure who it was. It must have been the CEO. I can't imagine any of the other employees can just post random comments from the account. Kurz Gazette replied saying, "Not going to reply to this video as you have made up your mind anyway."
Oh, well, actually, this, apparently it's just there, so we can actually just look at we can just look at the comment, right?
The YouTube channel.
Let's see. Very big fan of the implication at the very... Yeah, I bet you are, Hakeem. Is that comment gone? I don't... I guess Kurz Gazette took the comment down. Odd decision.
I posted my video shitting all over...
Here, let's see. Leaving weird comments, so multiple comments. They're terminally online. I remember a few years back when someone called them out, they responded almost immediately. The CEO gets terrified when there's anything bad to say. Really? Ha. I should see if they have anything that I can interrogate. That'd be a nice cynical move that might maybe grow the channel a little bit. Don't tell anyone. Shh. Shame YouTube deleted your replies to their comments. Okay, let's see.
Kurz Gazette's video on feeling hopeful about the absolutely awful situation on climate change. I thought it was especially important to make that video because in order to feel that way, you just have to completely gloss over the third world. And that's what most people do. That's what all this Western-centric political space always does. Gloss over the third world. Forget that they exist. At best, mention them in passing. But with how fucking awful climate change is for the third world, that video was just unconscionable. I couldn't let it slide. And Kurz Gazette found it. They literally left a comment responding to it within...
It was their first comment? Hang on.
The YouTube channel...
Wasn't that just Bad and Panada? Oh, I see what you mean. He copy and pasted it, got it. It was auto-deleted. YouTube keeps auto-deleting even my own comments on my channel. That's bizarre. Alright, well, I'm not going to reply to this video as you've made up your mind anyway. You also ignored our 65-page source document. That 65-page source document was bullshit. I looked at that myself earlier in this stream. Just wanted to comment on something wrong you said. We have no investors. Kurz Gazette is an independent channel and is almost entirely viewer-funded. That's wrong. We do not rely on sponsors like Bill Gates to keep the lights on. That's probably true given the number of views they have. Although we have worked with them and other sponsors from time to time because it makes things safer, which is important if you want to pay your team fair wages. Kurz Gazette, the sort of small business you should be rooting for. Fuck off. No, that's not what people mean by small businesses. Social media parasites, sorry. You fundamentally get something wrong here. Pandering to the worldview of a sponsor makes no sense if you consider the economics of it. While the Gates... What? What do you mean that makes no sense? While the Gates sponsorships were helpful, the amount we got over multiple years is not that much. If you need to pay 50 people, seriously do the math. That's a lot, though. That makes the thing self-sustaining. That's a lot of money. Look, like, that's enough to pay every single person without relying on any ad revenue whatsoever, like a decent middle to upper middle class income. Assuming that you're paying your staff like flat equally, which you're definitely not. While the Gates sponsorships are helpful, Gates organizations paid us not nearly enough for us to do their bidding or motivate us to please them. No, they gave you over $500,000. That's ridiculous. For example, Brilliant Alone, who also sponsored the video, funded us to a much, much larger degree than Gates, as did Skillshare or other organizations, but mainly our viewers fund us through Patron and their shop. So you have multiple streams of revenue. That doesn't really matter, though. Also, none of those... It doesn't... You don't need every single one of your sponsors to have a specific vested political interest. And I don't even necessarily agree that Gates did in this case. But you don't need the majority of your sponsors, or even more than one of your sponsors, to have a vested political interest in your message, so long as enough of them have none, such that one person who's gatekeeping an additional $500,000, if they do, you can risk slanting in that direction, especially when it's stuff like this and it's like soft. $600K divided by 50. Is it by 50? It's not 50 people, is it? I saw a staff of I think 8 or something like that. Let's see. Oh, he says 50 here. Okay. We need to pay 50. Why would they need to pay 50 people? These aren't 50-man productions. $50 people. Who are they? Are they including the researchers they contract out for? Because 50 people is a lot. 50 people is like when you're running like a cleaning company out of your basement or something. It includes researchers. So is Sunday helping Bad Imp? I'm looking at Bad Empanado's video. I'm not helping anybody. I do agree with the thrust of the argument so far. I have people in my audience who I respect who say that there are potential issues, so. More to the point, like this response doesn't touch on the important issue, which is that their fudging of the data is indefensible. Like you just, if I was Kurzgesagt and somebody had made the implications that Bad Empanada did, couched in, like this is one of the last things that he brings up, couched in, here's how all of your data is garbage, I wouldn't even acknowledge that point. I would just focus on the data points that he disagrees with. You accuse me of making up my mind, but you made up yours. You reiterate the same points in videos. Okay. That's his response. Oh my god, that's a long response. Oh wow, they literally have no reply to any of the factual issues. None. It's literally just, what do you mean we're getting paid by Bill Gates? We're also paid by Skillshare. That's ridiculous. Sorry for the voice. $1.5 million from Skillshare, huh? Damn. Again, though, like, it doesn't... I'm not even saying that Bad Empanada is right here, because I don't know that he is. And it wasn't apparent to me, even as he was saying it, that this is even really plausible. But the response is completely inadequate, because again, if you let's say they're making like $3 million from other sponsors, if those other sponsors don't care what they do, they just care about the ad investment that they're making, which works, because again, like the channel in question has 18 million subscribers. If those channels don't care what you do, and one channel offers you $500,000 to make a little, that's still $500,000. You might do that, and it might be safe to do so, especially when it's something like this, where you're making a fairly milquetoast statement ultimately, with like a hope and love kind of message, right? So, like that part there, I was getting sketchy on. And generally, I'm a little bit distrustful of Bad Empanada, again, for the reason that the way he comports himself makes me inherently suspicious of him. But for most of that last video, his critiques of the Kurzgesagt video were completely on point. They were elaborations on critiques that I myself made when I was watching it, that people in my audience made, so I have some sense that intelligent people have those issues too. So it's like... Gates gives them money because they're doing PR for his interests. Their videos on pesticides and GMOs were really tickled the Gates Foundation's assets. Yeah, so I don't even necessarily think that this video had anything to do with what Bill Gates in particular wanted. I think this was just they had a drive to produce content, as every content creator does, because that keeps revenue flowing, or keeps it growing. But their reply is equally meaningless. They probably started with the premise of an optimistic video on climate change for some good reasons, but put out a poor presentation, again, because they have a production cycle. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we were doomer last time. Let's be positive. And maybe their heart was even in the right place, sort of, where it's like, okay, well, let's try and do something that will, at the very least, not make people less motivated to try and do things about climate change, yada, yada, yada. Or maybe it'll just make people feel good or something. More cynically, to kind of keep the tension on, where we're not just like the Doomer channel, we're also the Hope channel, so it's like with your emotions, and you keep coming back for your next hit. And then as a result of, again, investing time and resources into this thesis, you can't then look at the data and go, wait a minute, this doesn't work. We've just lost 20 hours of time. Multiply that out for whoever's doing animations, for like storyboarding, scripting, organizing, like all that stuff, and all of the people who have to, like, make all that happen. So you just kind of roll with it. This is one of the reasons why you should never trust large educational channels like this, because the center of gravity is not towards doing good work. It is always towards producing charismatic work that appeals to the kind of person who cares more about the fact that there's a cute little Birdman on the screen with happy music than the factuality of the video itself. This is why spirit science works. Somebody mentioned this is like spirit science for science or whatever, and that's not wrong. It's the same strategy. They're not as bad as spirit science in the sense that they're not 100% bullshit, but they're possibly a little bit worse than spirit science in the sense that solid 40% of it maybe being conservative is bullshit, in which case they're actually probably doing real damage to how the average person actually engages with science, who is already motivated to engage with science. I think they have a video on how they make videos. I don't care. I know how they make videos. Like, everybody knows. Like, this is obvious. It's the same pressures that face every single content creator, just magnified a little bit, in terms of the values involved, like how much money, what's your return, yada yada yada, stuff like that. Okay. Anyways, we're over time, so I'm going to wrap it up here. I'm satisfied that the response by Kurzgesagt to Bad Empanada was garbage. Tomorrow we'll start to actually look at documents. We'll look at the IPCC report. We might have some guests on to talk that over. my mod Titan has kindly reached out, largely through In Time's platform, because they have a lot of really cool connections with researchers and scientists and whatnot. So we'll have some people who actually do research into this stuff, hopefully at some point, to provide some guidance and some insights, and that'll be good. So thanks everybody for joining me. We'll be a bit more I guess this was pretty research heavy anyways, just because we were looking at figures and a comparison of figures, but I'd like to actually go through the reports themselves, because at this point all we have is the juxtaposition of the Kurzgesetz's video and the response to it by Bad and Panada, and both are kind of out of repute in very general terms. So yeah, tomorrow IPCC report, and yeah, in addition, by the way, thanks to In Time for doing all this outreach work and finding all these researchers and all these interesting people that we will now be benefiting from. Give them a look if you haven't already. Their stuff is generally pretty good. And they're not like Kurzgesagt. They will actually, if they make mistakes, which we all do, they will go back, they will announce them, and they will fix them, which is rare, tragically. All right. Arrivederci. Have a good night.